And we're live.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Barbara Peters from the Poison Pen, dressed in my Chinese outfit because we're going to be talking about Taiwan and the South China Sea. Right now, it's Ukraine and Russia that are getting all the real life attention, but none of us should take our eye off Taiwan. And also the consequences of what happens with Russia and the Ukraine might have a considerable bearing on whether China decides to go for whatever it might happen to go for in Taiwan. So an interesting question. Anyway, we are at this point oversold on Tom Clancy, Flashpoint, but Ian has snagged a copy, is not letting go in the mail until tomorrow morning. But Don happily will be back at the Poison Pen on June 13th, and we are ordering in a whole bunch more. So if you can be patient for a couple of weeks, we will have more autographed copies. If you're impatient, we will order an unsigned copy or two. In our little world, we sometimes forget that not everybody actually requires a signed book. I mean, it just doesn't. So, and with us today, we have Brian, and he's going to be soloing because his buddy Jeff, the two of them taking over Tom Clancy Sr. in 2024, was called away, family duty. Or maybe you just wanted to go out for a drink somewhere.
Could be that. Could be that.
I think when you have 4 kids, you never know. Things always pop.
That's really true. Family first. So it
Family
goes.
first.
Right. So anyway, I'm somewhat handicapped by not having a book to show or whatever it is. So, but I can say that Don's last Tom Clancy or Jack Ryan Jr. book was number 2 on the New York Times bestseller list, which was the best that's happened for 10 years, Tom?
10 years. Yeah. That was pretty cool.
It was. So we'll see how this Target week goes. At least Jack published last week. So,
yeah.
Right. Which I have to say was a truly spectacular event, although I did feel for the Poison Pen staff who all had to give up whatever their Mother's Day plans were until evening. So I had written them all copious thank you notes and bought them each a tank of gas and, did what I could. But anyway, it was amazing. So I think, the reason I mentioned that is I think, a rising tide lifts all boats. And I think as there's a huge success in military fiction, that it raises everybody's interest in more of it. So, so it's good news for everyone. Let me also add, before I turn this over to Brian, who I hope has wonderful questions since I am hopeless, that Don is going to be moving into the Vince Flynn universe. And he will be here on September 11th with Kyle Mills, who kind of doing the handover, so to speak, in the same way that Mark Cameron is going to be handing over the Jack Ryan Sr. series to Brian and Jeff. So there's sort of constant churn going on. And maybe that's the question you guys should address is why does somebody write in somebody else's universe and then at some point exit? Or in your case, Don, roll over to a different one. But anyway, Brian, over to you.
Well, I really do love that question, Barbara. Maybe we start just a little bit, Don, just with that. When you first got asked by Tom to step into the Jack Ryan Jr. series, did you have any trepidation about that?
Yeah, I had a huge amount of trepidation because so Red Storm Rising was the first Tom Clancy book I wrote, and I was 14. And
no, that you read. You didn't read.
That I read, yes. That's an important distinction. When I was 14 and wrote Red Storm Rising, yes, the first one
you
that I
were
read,
punching above your weight class for sure back then.
The whole book is fantastic, and especially for a kid growing up in the Cold War. I was a kid of the 80s, so I remember the Berlin Wall. I remember it coming down. I remember movies like Red Dawn, which seem kind of chintzy now. Back then, when you watched it, you thought maybe that really could be a real thing. And so I remember reading that book, and there's a scene in there where an F-14 is doing a strafing run on this Russian container ship or Soviet container ship that's got a Russian, I think, armored division in it or armored brigade. And it just felt real to me. And it felt, against the backdrop of what everyday life was like, it felt maybe a little too real. And so I'd always been from that day forward, a huge fan of Tom Clancy and that genre in particular. And so I knew there were other writers writing in the genre. I knew by the time I got asked to write come into the Tom Clancy universe, I knew Mark Greene well enough to talk to him about it. And in fact, our editor, Tom Colgan, said, when he asked me, he said, before you answer, I want you to talk to Mark Greene because he's going to shoot you straight. And so Mark, being Mark, has the deserved reputation of being the nicest guy in publishing. And so we got on the phone together and he started the conversation by saying, I'm not going to tell you to do this. I'm going to give you the honest truth and let you make the decision, but I'm not going to pressure you. And by the end of the conversation, he was like, you have to do this. You have to write. And so, it was incredibly awe-inspiring to get the opportunity, but I think it's also, we were fans long before we were writers. And for me, just the opportunity to help that legacy live a little bit longer was way too good to turn down. What was it like for you guys, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, we didn't see it coming because we had been asked to do the Rogue Asset book, which was in the Presidential Agent series for Webb Griffin.
Mm-hmm.
So we were focused on that. And then, we didn't know that Mark was ready to, to step down. I mean, he's done so much amazing work. And I think that there's sort of this ox yoke of weight you're carrying, when you're doing these books, because they have to be so big and it's a lot of responsibility. And I think, Mark is like, hey, you know what? I've taken my turn. I've carried the torch and I ran that relay leg like as fast as I could and I've delivered. And I think he's ready. He really was ready to pass the torch, but we had no idea. We had absolutely no idea that was coming. So when Tom approached us, it was just sort of like, we kind of maybe thought it was a joke at first, like, are you kidding? But he wasn't kidding. And so, I think you have to step back and sort of say, am I ready to carry that weight, Yeah. And you have to dig deep and feel that confidence, I guess, that you can do it. And I don't know if you ever really feel like you're going to be ready.
Yeah.
Right. Let me intervene and say there are two Marks in this mix, and it can be confusing. Mark Greene, Mark with a K, was writing the Jack Ryan Jr. series that Don is talking about. Mark Cameron, Mark with a C, is writing the Jack Ryan Sr., which is what Brian is talking about. And in our conversation, if you're watching this who didn't watch me talk to Mark last week, he talked about the fact that he not only wants to expand the series he's currently writing with the Marshal, but he's missing some of his own characters, some of the older books that he did. And for every book you write, there's a book you can't write. And as he's getting older, he feels like he'd really like to write more books in his own universe and, carry on. When we talked to Kyle, Kyle is missing his own characters and felt like maybe he had said whatever he could say about Vince. So I guess that was part of my question is there a point when you feel like, you wouldn't know that because, particularly you, Brian, as you hadn't even started yet.
Right.
Maybe there's a point at which you feel like you have said all you can say, or want to say about these characters, and somebody can bring some fresh energy, to it. I don't know. I'm sorry Jeff isn't here so he could give us his perspective, but are you speaking as one? Are you like Siamese twins?
We share a brain. He passed me the brain, so I've got it in here.
No, Mark Greene said something similar to me, Barbara, that he also said, there'll come a point in time where you just know that you can't write another book in this series, that you have given everything that you have to offer, and that if you tried to do another one, it would be a step back from what you've done already. And so I think the wish or the hope is that you go out on top, that you write, your last book is a great book and you've done everything you can for the series, and then you pass it to somebody else.
And what's kind of cool about that is that actually sort of a metaphor for military service in general, right? Like at some point, you know, you say, okay, it's time to pass the baton to the next generation of,
Yeah.
you know, in my case, submarine officers and to use a sports, you know, analogy, the leave it all on the field type of thing. That's really what it's like. I mean, you give it your all and
Yeah.
you leave it all on the field. And when it's time to be done, I don't think there's any, you don't begrudge yourself for that. It just, it feels like that's the right thing to do.
Well,
Yeah.
hilariously, guys, I have to tell you, there's even a moment like that in the life of a bookseller. I mean, you know, people are always saying to me, when am I going to retire? And I have to think about, you know, passing the torch on to the next generation of people running the Poison Pen. And, you know, people say, well, it won't be the same. And I say, it shouldn't be. You know, it shouldn't be.
Yeah.
It should be something different, just as
Yeah.
what you're discussing. I mean, there's a point in life. I mean, look at the Dianne Feinstein thing. I was just reading the Washington Post saying, you know, if she's going to tarnish her legacy, if she
Yeah.
can't bring herself, you know, to recognize that her period of excellent service in the Senate has come to an end due to her health. And, you know, that's so hard for people to step aside. So I admire you guys, you know, that are able to say, okay, you know, I've carried the torch. And now it's time to, you know, pass the baton. That's a hard thing to do.
I think almost in some ways it's a little easier that it's not yours, because I think whenever it's yours, right? That's why, you know, if you look at FDR and when he kept running for president and running for president again, that it is that it's hard when it's your legacy to say it's enough, I've done everything, to walk away. I think when it's somebody else's, it helps bring a little bit of distance to it, and you can look at it more objectively and say, at the end of the day, it's still going to be Tom Clancy's. And do I think I'm still contributing something to it? Or can I honestly look and say, I've done my best work, somebody else needs to come in and do it? And maybe it's a little easier to do that when there's the distance that's provided to you by writing for an estate instead of your own series.
It's a really good point. Of course, FDR, I mean, I understand the war complicated the whole thing. It's not clear to me that he would have run again.
Sure.
If he hadn't thought, you know, that it would be a dangerous signal. But anyway, let's talk about this book. You know, South China Sea, Taiwan. Wow. And you've been in Korea, because I mean, I thought you wrote a really kick-ass book.
Thank you.
North and South Korea. I love that book, as you know. So how come you're so interested in the Pacific theater then?
So I had a couple things. My last job I made, I worked for a company that made uniforms and hide sites and stuff that masked both your thermal and visual signatures. And so they were kind of camouflage on steroids. And so the reason why that was so important was because, for instance, when we went into Afghanistan in 2001, we still had a technology overmatch in that the Taliban were some of the best light infantry in the world, but we owned the night. We did all the operations at night. There was a technological overmatch. Now, 20 years later, some of that overmatch has faded. And in fact, the person that founded the company that I worked for was an Israeli commando who, during the Second Lebanon War, went into Lebanon with his team at night and thought he still owned the night. But Hezbollah had been provided with Russian-made thermal sights by the Iranians. And so he was shot and several of his team members were killed. And it just drove home this idea to him that there was no longer that technological overmatch. It was almost more of a near peer fight because of that. And so if you take that writ large, that's what's happening right now to U.S. military doctrine, is we're realizing that for the last 20 years, we fought an asymmetrical fight against primarily insurgents. And now all of a sudden, it's like we've woken up and realized that while we've been distracted in Iraq and Afghanistan, we now face close to a near peer fight with China, and that it'll be very, very different, and that the cost of that fight could be astronomically larger. And so it's it's funny because U.S. politicians from both sides of the aisle come into office thinking, here's what I'm going to focus on. And President Obama famously had hey, now we're going to pivot to Asia, and he didn't get the chance because the world didn't let him, right? There was still the surge in Afghanistan. There were still things. Well, because of that, now China has grown to be a big enough threat that we're behind the curve there. And it's interesting. There was a fact when I was doing the research now that says every year the Chinese Navy adds the equivalent to the entire Australian Navy to their own. So every year they grow by the size of the entire Australian Navy. And there's a guy I listen to on the radio a lot. His name's Admiral Stavridis. He was the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, and he likes to say that quantity is a quality all of its own. And so because the Chinese Navy is so large, the Chinese footprint is so large, that for the first time since World War II, perhaps we might face an adversary that is either our equivalent or near to our equivalent from a technology standpoint, and greater than we are from a numbers perspective. And so I had from doing that job with the camouflage companies, one of our customers was a reserve naval officer who flew P-3 Orions, and he would tell me stories about the South China Sea. And to most Americans, you look at it, if you're not a navalist like Brian, perhaps, you're like, why does that matter? Why does this stretch of ocean that's however many thousands of miles on the other side of the world in this little island, why does that matter to me as an American? And it's interesting when you start to dig into that and say, you know what, not only, putting aside Chinese aggression and just looking at the fact that perhaps for the first time again since before World War II, we might not be able to guarantee freedom of navigation in the seas anymore. That if China is allowed to claim the entire South China Sea as their own, if they're allowed to, encroach into Taiwan, and then what would that mean for trade from the United States? And so there were kind of all of these interesting things that led to it. And to your point, what happened is the book became much bigger than a typical Jack Ryan Jr. book. In fact, when my editor, Tom Colgan, got it, he's like, you've written a Jack Ryan Sr. book. And it's because as I was telling the story, I needed that bigger picture to be able to see what are the geopolitical ramifications, what are the strategic ramifications of what's happening. And so I had to, and we can go a little bit more in detail, I had to strike some bargains with Mr. Cameron because I needed to be able to show Jack Ryan Sr. in the White House. I needed to be able to show what was transpiring and how that related to Jack Ryan Jr. And so it ended up being a really difficult book to write because the stakes were so large, but hopefully it's a really fun book to read.
Let's talk about the title Flashpoint, because I like the title.
Yeah.
First, when did you come up with that? Okay. And let's talk about sort of the genesis of why you think that title represents the book.
Yeah. And so what you see in the book is that I kind of, in answering Barbara's question, I kind of made it seem like the entire book is built around a Chinese grab of Taiwan. And it's not that. But what it is more of the U.S. and China kind of stumbling towards a accidental confrontation in the South China Sea that could end up turning into World War III. And so it was interesting. I have another friend that I worked with when I got out of the Army at GE, and he was a P-3 Orion pilot as well, and was telling me about the P-3 Orion that collided with the Japanese fighter that landed on, a Chinese fighter that landed on Chinese soil, and what the ramifications were. And I kind of remembered that. I remembered, the crew being paraded about and us having to jump through some diplomatic hoops to get him back. But we came really close to war at that period of time.
They had to land on Hainan Island.
Yes. Yep. That's exactly right. Thank you. I couldn't remember the name of the island. And so what you don't understand is when you look at a P-3 or now P-7, if you look at the P-7 Poseidon, which is on the front of the book, it looks like an ordinary airplane. The P-7 is based on the Boeing 737, but inside of that airplane, it's an incredibly complex spy aircraft, basically. And so when that P-3 crash landed, the crew inside were literally tearing apart the computers and trying to sanitize it before the Chinese got their hold on it. And it was a huge intelligence coup for the Chinese. And so I kind of wanted to recreate that sense of what if it had gone the other way? What if it had been a collision that maybe had actually lent itself to war, or what if it had been done purposefully? And so I was looking at that, and I'm not really great usually at coming up with titles. I have some that Tom Colgan tends to reject outright. And then he's like, what about these? And I'm like, no, I don't like those either. And so we kind of go back and forth about it. And he's like, well, what is the book about? And I think at one point I said, it's like a flashpoint where all of these events come together, and it could be war because of something innocuous. Everybody loves to tell the story of World War I, of a driver turning down the wrong street and then Archduke, being assassinated, and that kicking off World War I. And it was certainly a little more complicated than that. But from a novelist perspective, that idea just intrigued me, of there being a flashpoint, perhaps unintended, perhaps intended, that then leads to war between two peer nations.
Yeah, that really resonates me. And it's sort of ironic, actually, because when I was active duty, I was in theater when that incident happened. That P3 incident had to land on an island. And so we were an asset that was out there sort of at the tip of the spear, sort of, watching the Chinese response, in real time.
Yep. Yeah. And you were kind enough to help me. I'm sure you're going to berate me at some point later on for my poor submarine writing skills. But Brian was very kind to read several drafts of the submarine scenes. Like I said, this is a much bigger book. And so in addition to Jack Ryan Jr. running around getting in trouble like he always does, there's an entire point of view character where you get to see Mary Pat in the White House with the president as he's trying to make sense of it. And then there is a point of view character that is a American skipper on a fast attack submarine. And then also the pilots of that P8 Orion, or P8 Poseidon rather, that have the collision that takes us ever closer to war. And so Brian was super helpful, both with the submarine, and then kind of gave me a sense of what happened in real life during that time, so I could replicate a little bit of it, even though I had to deal with his sarcasm and beratement for failing to accurately depict a submarine the first or second time around.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that the fans will give you a free pass because they know you're.
Many of them have actually served on a submarine, Don, so it's probably going to be okay. Do you know, it's reminding me, this discussion, I can't remember because I talked to so many of you guys, but I think it was Jack Carr. But anyway, the Cuban crisis, where the Russian guy, had to make a decision, and and chose not to nuke it, but I mean, it was a really near run thing. Again, it takes, the right person at the right moment can flash history in either direction. But the other thing I've been thinking about listening to you is that, we had the Pax Britannica during the 19th century. The British had the biggest navy, right? From Trafalgar on up. I'm going to send you guys a copy of a series by a guy named Galernter, who has written 3 books about a naval guy in the Napoleonic Wars that I think are almost up to Patrick O'Brien quality. But these battle scenes talking about, the ships and how they're configured and, how they do all that stuff. But anyway, they kept everything relatively peaceful. And then since World War II, but all of a sudden, the Pax Americana is fraying.
And I'll be the first to admit, like, I'm not a navalist, and so I tend to downplay that because I don't, I've never, until you look at this, to understand the distances between the West Coast of America and, China, Taiwan and stuff, and how long that would take to transit resupplies. Because we look at what's going on right now in Ukraine with the Russian invasion, and how long it takes us to get supplies and arms to the Ukrainians. trying to do that across the Pacific Ocean or to resupply Taiwan after a potential invasion and stuff, the distances and times are just mind-boggling. And Brian, as a former naval officer, understands that really well. Me as a former Army officer, frankly, I didn't. And so another guy I listen to quite a bit is he's a congressman from Wisconsin. His name's Mike Gallagher. He was a former Marine intelligence officer. He's now a PhD, and he chairs the select committee on China. And so it was fascinating because he's constantly beating that drumbeat. And here recently, he walked his entire committee through a war game. He had a private company come in and do a war game of what an invasion, Chinese invasion of Taiwan might look like. And he said, the losses that the United States sustained were staggering, and that we ran out of all of our smart weapons within the first week of the war. And so, it's just incredible now to watch those tactics change in real time. Another issue of that, and Brian can probably talk a little bit better, is that aircraft carriers have been the center of gravity since they came of age in World War II. But now with hypersonic weapons and things that can potentially reach out and touch them, there's this whole now thing. Do we need to re-look at taking, whatever, $5 or $6 billion worth of men and equipment and locating it all on this one ship that now is potentially extremely vulnerable to the missile systems that the Chinese have developed specifically to defend their coast in a potential incursion into Taiwan? And so as a writer, it's pretty fascinating to watch that unfold in real time. As an American, it might be a little terrifying.
Yeah, I had an interesting opportunity. Jeff and I were doing research for our book, and we met with a Hornet squadron. And these are the guys that are flying the Hornets off of the carrier, right? That's the whole purpose. The whole reason you have the carrier is just so that you have this air power that you can project, across, like you said, across these vast distances. Very reactive. It was interesting when we were talking to these guys that, the unit commander said something very similar to what you mentioned about quantity is a quality all of his own. He's like, because I had said to him, I read that you guys are going to be getting potentially some air to surface launch hypersonics potentially that you might be able to carry on the Hornet. He's like, yeah, maybe we'll get 15. He's like, it'll cost, $100 million. He's like, I'd rather just have a whole bunch of bombs, give me quantity, he's like, give me a whole bunch of things that I can shoot instead of one, hypersonic that maybe I can carry up there and launch. And it does a great job, but then I'm out, he's like, yeah. So I think maybe there is some thinking in the Navy right now, the mindset is recognizing that quantity over quality is its own form of asymmetric warfare, right?
Yeah.
And so we need to be thinking about that.
And that actually,
sorry,
go ahead, Barbara.
Do you think the Japanese had really thought that through when they attacked Pearl Harbor about how they were going to sustain a war across the Pacific?
That's an excellent question. I mean, the Japanese, I think we had sort of a different level of complexity with the weapon systems. And, if you read Freedom's Forge, which is a fascinating book, it sort of talks about the fact that, the argument that the author makes is that the reason we won World War II is not because of our military might, it's because of our military industrial complex and the fact that we could manufacture ships faster than the Japanese, and we could manufacture more bombs and more bullets and more, was the Mustang the best dogfighting plane in World War II? No, it was not. But we made them faster than the Germans and the Japanese could make Zeros. So, now we're sort of in a flip-flop with China where, they can make a boat, they can make a destroyer in 6 months. It takes us 2 years. So, like you said, where does that leave us, Don?
Well, the Civil War, the North won the Civil War on the same basis, it had a bigger military industrial complex than the agricultural South.
Yeah.
So you're right. At some point, if you run out of weapons, I mean, I think that's where Russia's really vulnerable. It may be here, but it's harder for them to get stuff down to if they could have done a better job, they probably would have already wiped it out.
Yeah.
But
I just saw that they're bringing some ancient World War II tanks. I don't remember the nomenclature, Don, you might know. I think it's the T-54s or something. They're bringing them out of storage, and they're not even functional, but they're using them as artillery because they can't move, but at least they have something to shoot. That's astounding, right?
Yeah.
It really is. So, Don, one more question. Do you think, in any of your research, do you think China's actually worried about anybody invading China, or is this whole thing about China wanting to reclaim Taiwan, which is a huge loss of face issue for them? Do they really want the Philippines? Do they really want? I can't quite work out what it is their game plan is, other than to reclaim Taiwan because they're unhappy that, so much stuff from China went there at the end of the war.
Yes, I'll say it's twofold. And again, I'll defer to Brian chiming in as a navalist after this, but it's been really interesting listening to, because again, Mike Gallagher comes onto the show I listen to every Tuesday and gives a summary of the last week's hearings and stuff. And the point that he makes as a military intelligence, former military intelligence officer, is that if you want to know what the Chinese are thinking, you need to look and see what President Xi says to the Chinese Communist Party in their meetings in Chinese. That not when he's talking to Western things, like what is he saying to his own people? And the two things that, or the things that he seems to echo over and over again, is that, Taiwan, that is non-negotiable, and that, to prepare for the fact that they are going to take Taiwan by force if necessary. And then once you have Taiwan, it does two things. So first off, it certainly reunifies China and saves face and does all the other things. But the amount of ocean you then control if you have Taiwan in the Taiwanese Strait. When I was doing the research, and it's in the book, I can't remember the exact percentage, but it's something like upwards of 80% of the world's shipping passes through that strait in that area. And so you literally can then, if you control that, put a stranglehold on the rest of the world and the rest of the world's commerce. And that, again, it goes back to, we would then be in the position where we can no longer guarantee the freedom of navigation on the seas. And so you see the Chinese right now, they have this really interesting, it's something, I'm not going to get the term right, but it's something like the merchant marines, where they have their own civilian ship captains and stuff that are constantly have these flotillas, these mob fleets that push against other countries' fishing vessels and are combative with them and move them out of the way. And so, do they want to necessarily, like what the Japanese did, take over the Philippines? I don't know about that, but they certainly want that area of the ocean where they're fishing, where the mineral resources are, and would be able to, once they have Taiwan and the Taiwanese Strait, would it be able to much more easily make their 9-dash, which is, the Chinese version of basically the entire South China Sea is ours, and these 9 dashes, everything within that territory exists as ours. The only people who can push back at that successfully right now is the United States. And we have, one of the things in 2 presidential elections ago was a promise to get back to a 300 ship Navy. Like the United States Navy right now, and Brian, you can correct me if I have it wrong, is I think the lowest, maybe not it's been in history, but certainly since World War II. It's like 250 or something ships right now. And it's just not enough. Even if you have the best high-tech ships in the world, you don't have enough quantity to be able to project power right now. Hey, Brian, I think you're muted, bud.
Sorry about that. I think it's something maybe we've all taken for granted too, right? Because it's been so long, this idea of freedom of the seas. It's almost like the world has just taken this for granted, that this is the way it is. It's really not the way it is. I mean, for the vast majority of naval history, there have been pirates and the seas have been contested. And so, we've had this, really, since World War II, we've had this propulsive economic growth that's been a result of the fact that the U.S. has been sort of the global maritime policeman. And like you said, Don, I think we're at the risk of maybe that disintegrating over, and China doesn't even recognize sort of the rest of the international freedom of the seas sort of boundaries, right? So
Yeah.
they kind of make their own rules up as they go along.
Complacency is the enemy of all empires. It happens every single time. People get rich, they get fat and happy. It's bread and circuses. It's the whole bit. You can see it. If you just, I'm an historian. I'm not a military person, but you can watch it all the way from Egypt and Rome and whatever. And I hope that we wake up in time. But there's such a strongly isolationist. We've been protected by our two oceans for so long that there's you can see it. Ron DeSantis. Americans sort of feel like, well, it's over there. It's not really. And but the Japanese brought it to us. If they hadn't brought it to us and we hadn't gone to war there, I'm not sure that Hitler would have declared war on the U.S. and we would have actually engaged in Europe because there was such a thing against it. So we have to fight that. So, but anyway, let's talk about some of the human elements of this. We've now done this grand, which I think has been fascinating, and thank you for all the education involved. But tell us a little bit more about Jack, because he has a personal life.
Yeah. So this is the third book in the third Jack Ryan Jr. book that I wrote, and what I've been trying to do with him with each one is say, how do I develop him a little bit more as a character and make him progress, I guess, and change a little bit as a character. And so the first book in Target Acquired was one of the things I had him wrestling with is, do I really belong here? Am I just here because my last name is Ryan, or do I have what it takes to actually be considered a no kidding operator in the campus? And then in 0 Hour, which you saw is kind of his first time as an ad hoc team leader, where he wasn't just solo and he wasn't the low man on the totem pole, so to speak. And then in this one, what you get to see is him dealing without going into spoilers or stuff, but dealing with some of the heavy things that come with leading people in combat as a team leader. And then what that means with you as a leader, what that means when things go wrong as the team leader, and how you have to pick yourself back up from that and do it. And so I start the book in a little town called Regensburg, Germany. My last assignment in the military was in Regensburg. It was in Hohenfels there. And so my youngest daughter was born in Regensburg Hospital. And so it's an amazing, Bavaria is just an incredible part of Germany anyway. And and I wanted to kind of start the book there and show some of the cool things that I loved about that town in particular. And then that area of Germany. And then you kind of jump from there to the Philippines and go from there. But there's another kind of neat thing that plays in Flashpoint, and it kind of goes back to the quantity versus quality perspective, is that because AI is all the buzz right now, and there's a portion that's maybe analogous to AI that's called machine learning, where for a while we've realized we can take these really cheap sensors and we can seed an ocean with them, or we can use them as radar receivers and stuff, and we can take the data from those cheap receivers and through machine learning draw conclusions in that data that humans wouldn't be able to on their own. And so that's kind of one of the themes you see in Flashpoint as well, is that up until this moment, the U.S., in addition to the most powerful surface navy, our subsurface navy has been undisputed. Brian once said, I think maybe when we were talking, I thought it was a pretty cool statement, that a submarine is the biggest, most expensive piece of technology in the world. And up until now, the U.S. has kind of been unrivaled with that. But you get to see a little bit of that in Flashpoint, where maybe it's not anymore. And then what are the repercussions for that?
Yeah. And you open with something that's sort of interesting. You open with the electronic warfare element, right? So you start getting into this idea that, the next generation, there's sort of two things happening, right? We like to think of a kinetic environment tactically, especially like with the 20-year war on terror.
Yep.
We think about when we think about it, we use the word kinetic, we think tactically.
Yeah.
But now there's this whole entire electromagnetic spectrum that's being exploited for both intelligence collection, but also electronic warfare.
Yeah.
And so you open the book with that, and I find it fascinating that you've incorporated that element into the thriller too. So why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so a while, I don't think I was even writing the Clancy books yet, but I remember stumbling across this paper that some Australian scientists had written that basically said they were, in the flashy headline of the paper was, "We're able to detect B-2 stealth bombers." And so they weren't, but what they were able to do was say, if we know that they're flying at this period of time, we can go back and through whatever sort of radar they used, go do regression on the data and say, yes, here is the disturbances in the air or whatever that we were able to show that the B-2 bombers were flying. And so if you fast forward it, a while ago, I think it was DARPA or IARPA came out with a solicitation that said, hey, we want these cheap little Coke can size sensors that we can seed in the ocean to that cost $20 a piece or something, that measure salinity, that measure temperature, that measure current, all of these different things, so that we can get a database, if you will, of the ocean. Well, you can kind of put those two things together and say, well, another concept of that is that you could use these cheap disposable sensors that maybe can move around a little, but maybe not, that just take all this data and offload it to some machine learning algorithms and stuff that can perhaps draw conclusions from that. And one of the conclusions might be, in the same way that the Australian scientists detected B-2 bombers, that perhaps an adversary can now detect what was the greatest stealth invention in the world, the fast attack submarine or a boomer submarine, and be able to tell where it passed. And so that was part of the book. The other part that was interesting that I kind of started with as well is that we talk a lot now about rare earth metals, because we use them for everything from car batteries for our electric vehicles to some of the other reason why Taiwan is so important is, again, upwards of 80 or 90% of all the very high-tech microchips are made in that country, and many of them require rare earth metals, where there are deposits of these I forget the word, these metallic cubes on the ocean's floor, these metallic ore pieces that could also be used for rare earth metals. And so there are actually a couple of companies that said, hey, we're going to try and mine those as an alternative, vacuuming up off the ocean's floor. And there are all kinds of environmental considerations of what that would do. But I kind of put all those things together and said, if I'm China and there's a stranglehold of rare earth metals, and we have a deposit potentially of those rare earth metals in a contested piece of ocean, in the South China Sea, what would I do to be able to get to those? And so all of those things kind of come together in Flashpoint.
Well, Barbara had talked about the human element. And so you might be the first one to introduce a little romance. You sort of dipped your toe into that, right? So Jack has a girlfriend. Why don't you talk about Lizanne?
Yeah, so Mark Cameron did that to me. And he, when I was writing Target Acquired, I was, 3/4 of the way through and thought I was going to do one thing for Jack Ryan Jr. And old Mark Cameron texted me and he said, hey, by the way, the book I just finished, Jack Ryan Jr. brings this girl Lizanne home to mom and dad. So there you go. And I'm like, oh. But then the more I started thinking about it, I was like, you know what? The guy that Jack Ryan Jr. wants to be is his father. And when his father was his age, so in his early 30s, which I think is when Hunt for the Red October was probably the age Jack Ryan was in Hunt for the Red October, he had a wife, he had kids, he had stability, and he achieved all this. And his son doesn't have any of that. And so I've kind of taken Lizanne, and that's another thing, is kind of progress that relationship. Because, when I put myself in Jack Ryan Jr.'s shoes and said, hey, I have achieved this thing I've always wanted. I'm a full-fledged member of the campus. I'm this operator. but I'm looking around and it's kind of an empty life, right? In that I don't have that family. I don't have that stability that my mom and dad had at that same point in my life. And so what you see is that Lisanne and Jack Ryan Jr.'s relationship has progressed with each book, and it might progress a little farther in this one.
Oh, right. So is that going to be a challenge for you, Brian and Jeff, to, I mean, after all, if they're the parents, they're, right, and you're all writing in real time, aren't you? Even though, it's been forever since it all started, but you guys are even though the characters aren't aging all that quickly, but you're still trying to write them as contemporaneously as you can.
And it's even worse. I'll jump in before Brian answers to set the stage even for, because it's even worse for him and for Jeff now, is because this year 2 Jack Ryan Jr. books come out, then there are actually 3 books that will come out before Brian and Jeff write their first one. And so this was the first time. It usually was Mark would be finishing his book as I was starting mine, and then vice versa, so we could give each other some idea. And this time I wrote 2 books and was writing a book as Mark was writing his book, and my book was going to come out first. And so I told him I was going to stick it to him for that thing he did to me for Lisanne. But go ahead, Brian.
Oh, no, yeah, I think we're in trouble. I mean, I think you guys need to brief us on everything that's going on, because you're writing so fast. We don't know everything that's going on. I think we might try to stay away from Jack Ryan Jr. Not because we don't love him, because it's like he's your guy. So our plan right now is to focus on Senior, but we actually do have a little surprise that we're not going to talk about, but we're gonna bring in a character or 2 that nobody's ever seen before, that we're really, really, really excited about.
And that is something Mark and I think I told the story before, when we were feeling each other out. At one point, he was just like, I'll write the old guys and you write the young guys. And we divided that, and it worked all right for the first 2 books. But for this book, because it's such a big book and it's more a Jack Ryan Sr., I needed to show Jack Ryan Sr. I needed to show. And so we had to do some negotiating, because I didn't want, for a fan's perspective, I didn't want them to read one of my books and say, now Don is writing Jack Ryan Sr. and it seems different than Mark's Jack Ryan Sr. Or now Don's writing John Clark and he seems different than Mark's. And so what I did for this one is, one of my favorite characters who I didn't think was used as much as she should be is Mary Pat Foley. Like, I love Cardinal of the Kremlin. I love the stuff that she did. And so I use her as the point of view character for the reader to be able to see what's going on in the Situation Room and stuff, so that I'm not trying to write Jack Ryan Sr. like Mark does, but I'm still giving the reader, here's what's going on, here are the decisions he's making. And it was really fun, because I reread Cardinal of the Kremlin before I started writing this one, to kind of put me back in her mind and what she's thinking and what she's been doing. And that was really fun. But I think what Jeff said, the only way you can do this and make this work with multiple writers doing it is you have to fence off different characters or different plot lines. Because I think, and it's not even so much as the writers, it is hard for us, but we just want to keep the experience true to the fans and not make it jarring for them when they move from one book to another.
Takes great communication. So I think I asked you this before, but what effect are the movies, if any, having on you? Because the Jack Ryan movies are, what are they? So for 3, is it 2 or 3?
It's they just finished, I think, the 3rd season and of the Jack Ryan. And then to your point, they had Without Remorse get remade. And then I believe they're about to do a remake of Rainbow Six. So they are.
There have been 3, because the first one I can remember. The second one I didn't like in South America. I thought it had sort of a dumb plot.
Clear and Present Danger.
The last one I thought was really good. And obviously they spent a fortune, going all around the locations and everything. But, he seems to have a life of his own. So do we just, from a fan's perspective, you just assume that TV Jack is TV Jack and Book Jack is Book Jack?
Yeah, and honestly, I wish they made it a little easier for the reader for that, because what happens is that if you're younger than 30, or 30 or younger, let's say, you're probably coming to Tom Clancy either through the video games or through one of those movies or through the Jack Ryan series that's streaming on Amazon. And so if you watch the first season of Jack Ryan with John Krasinski, and then you pick up a Clancy book written by Marker Eye, you're not going to have any idea what's going on. And so what I tell people is that if they're not, I said, the character that John Krasinski plays in that series is really about the same age as the character I write, even though it's his son. And so the two worlds are completely different, but I really wish they made a better effort to tie those in, because I think other than just putting John Krasinski on the cover now of all the old Clancy books, I think they could leverage that a lot better, perhaps, to bring new readers to the series.
Yeah, because that television series is really a reboot. It's taking Jack Ryan Sr. and putting him into the modern world, when in fact, in the book series, he's the president and he's much older. He's generations older. So you're right. I mean, the Krasinski character is really more akin to Jack Ryan Jr.
Yeah.
Well, that's honestly, when I watched the first one, I thought that's who he was. I didn't even think about it being Jack Ryan Sr. I thought, oh, look, here's Jack Ryan Jr. So, yeah, I mean, anyway. So, Don, when is the next one? Because you have an exorbitant number of books.
Yes. So the next one is called Weapons Grade, and that comes out, it's either the 3rd or 5th of September. And so I finished copy edits for it last week and are frantically trying to get that whipped into shape. But it's another one where because Flashpoint was such a big book, I told my editor, Tom Colgan, I'm like, I'm just going to write something small. I'm going to write about Jack Ryan Jr. being in this little town in Texas. And he's like, kind of like a Reacher book. And I'm like, yeah, kind of like that. And so I started writing, and 4 months later, he sent me titles and covers for what would have been great if the book still had anything to do with a small Texas town. And so I said, I remember what I said, but now it's really about the Iranians having a clandestine enrichment facility and them reaching breakout on a nuclear weapon. And to his credit, he responded back with 2 words: cool. Does the enrichment facility to blow up? And I'm like, yes. So then he went back to redo the cover and stuff. And so it was really fun. It ended up being a big book again. And we've been talking about hypersonics a lot. I was really, really interested in that. And so hypersonics plays very big in this book. And in fact, I've resurrected the SR-71, and I got to spend 2 hours with an SR-71 pilot. He's probably in his late 60s, early 70s now, and talked me all through what flying that was like. And even though he used to fly one of the most complex aircraft in the world, we almost crashed our interview, me trying to talk this fighter pilot into how to use Zoom. But once we got that going, it was pretty spectacular. And then he actually let me use his name as the character for the SR-71 pilot that's in Weapons Grade. So I'm really excited about that too.
Wow, that's great. So as long as you're coming anyway on September 11th, I guess we might as well do Tom Clancy.
Oh, yeah. I didn't even put that together.
Yeah, why not? Have a whole deal. Feel free, Brian and Jeff, you want to roll in. I'm going to be on the Great Lakes doing my own naval adventure, but Star will be up for it. That'd be fun. But anyway, might as well. I thought for some reason that book had been moved to October.
Not that I know of, but maybe I need to check Amazon again.
Probably me. I don't know why. For some reason, I thought there was a little confusion with your publicist about what was happening. So I'll go check. But anyway, if it is that close, then we might as well, do
that'd be great.
I think so too. So Brian Andrews and Jeff Wilson, if you're wondering who Brian and Jeff are the 2 guys that only one currently, Brian with us. We'll be doing the Jack Ryan Seniors. So that'll be a really exciting 40th anniversary. I love this so much.
Yeah, we're really excited. I'm sorry Jeff couldn't be here tonight, but like I said, we share one brain. So I got the brain. So at least, He's speaking through my mouth, you know.
You guys, can you give a teaser on it at all? Because you and I have talked and it's super cool, but I don't know how much you can tell.
Is it too early?
Yeah, no, I think we certainly can. I mean, the idea is, you know, when we found out that this book was going to release on the 40th anniversary of Red October, we thought it'd be really, really fun to do a very submarine centric sort of reboot, not a reboot, but almost like an homage to Red October. So, you know, just like Top Gun Maverick, you know, sort of captured all that nostalgia and went back and had some of the elements that you really liked from the original Top Gun, but then some new elements. We want to do the same thing with Act of Defiance. And what's really exciting about it is that, you know, some things have stayed the same in the submarine community in the past 40 years, but a lot of things have changed. And so, you know, our same adversary, Russia, is still at it. And you know, you could make an argument that the most capable element of their military is still their submarine fleet. And they're doing some really, really cutting edge things with both their design and their weapon systems. And so we wanted to sort of take one of those elements and say, you know, what would happen if Red October occurred now? You know, how would it play out differently than maybe it did in the 80s? So that's kind of the teaser for Act of Defiance.
That's awesome.
Wow, I love this. Now, as a person who actually went on the first passenger Northwest Passage cruise in whenever it was 2017, I know for sure that the shipping lanes are changing because, you know, you can now go over the top. I've actually been to Murmansk. Oh, let me tell you.
Wow.
But, you know, I mean, I'm serious. You know, it was 98 degrees when I was in Murmansk. So the thought that Russia did not have a warm water port, and therefore, when I was in Stanford, I actually wrote a paper about the importance of the Turkish Straits and the Dardanelles to Russia because it was their only warm water port for forever, which of course is one reason we got to St. Petersburg. But Murmansk is actually potentially now, you know, and trade that used to have to go all the way down through the Panama Canal, which of course is an upgrade from having to go all the way around Cape Horn, can now go over the top. And so, you know,
crazy.
much of what's going on the South China Sea may turn out to be less important in point of fact coming down from the north. But you know, it's going to have commercial implications, but it's also going to have real military implications if we're suddenly looking at a part of the world. Do you know you can now cruise around Greenland? I mean, hell, the first time I went to Greenland, you could land at Kotortok on the very south, you know, or Nunilnik, which was, and now you can actually go from Reykjavik or, you know, whatever it is, and just cruise around Greenland. And when we were in Holland, whenever it was 2019, and they took us to the North Sea defense that Holland has, which is really brilliant. I mean, it's a fabulous piece of engineering. But what I didn't realize is that Holland's at the other end of the plate from Greenland. So Holland went up when the glaciers, you know, hit Greenland. As the glaciers are melting, Holland is sinking.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's some huge changes, and all the climate deniers, you know, just they need to go to Holland. But I can really see, you know, all kinds of reconfigurations in terms of military strategy, weaponry, and a little bit as all of these things happen. So, and it's going so fast, you guys may have to account for that while you're writing. Anyway, Ian, I've gone on too long. Come pop up and tell us if there are any questions or anything that anybody would like to ask.
Yes, there are a few questions here. For Don, did Tom Colgan ever mention to you what it was about your writing that prompted him to invite you to write Clancy books?
Ooh.
Just that I was much, much better than Brian and Jeff. That was his main. No, in all seriousness, what he did say is that it was, so he didn't ask me until I'd finished my second book, which was The Outside Man. And he said that a lot of people have one book in them because you have your entire life to write that first book. And then when you get, if you're fortunate enough to get a multi-book contract and you have to write that second book under pressure, under a deadline, a lot of folks fold on that. And so he obviously liked my writing enough to buy without sanction, but I think it was writing the second book and writing it in the same style and stuff that he kind of prove to him that I could do it. What I will say, the big asterisk that I put on there is that Tom does not expect nor want you to try and write in Clancy's style. He describes what we do as fan fiction, that we write our own style in that universe. And so it certainly wasn't because I wrote like Clancy did, because nobody can write like Clancy did. I was just fortunate enough to have him as an editor, and after writing my second book, he knew that I could write books under a deadline, and the opportunity came up. So I think it's like anything else in life where, part of it is luck, and part of it is showing up and being there when luck strikes or lightning strikes.
I mean, Tom told me, John, that you only had 5 books in you, so you've exceeded his expectations so far, and you've exceeded mine as well. So, bravo.
How does your experience differ when writing Jack Ryan Jr. books versus your Matt Drake series? Is one easier or more enjoyable than the other? And are there different challenges writing Jack versus Matt?
Yeah, I think I'm, again, kind of lucky in that regard, because Brad Taylor for a long time wrote 2 books a year. And then I believe in addition to 2 full-length novels, he also wrote at least 1, if not 2 novellas in between. And putting aside the sheer magnitude of that kind of output, writing the same characters back to back like that, I think it would just burn me out. And when you talk to Brad, he says that was some of the toughest couple of years in his writing career. And so being able to switch from Matt to Jack Ryan, I alternate every other book, has been kind of a godsend, because when I get to write Matt, it feels like I'm coming home again. And then when I finish a Matt book, it's like I get to do, even though obviously it's the same genre and it's very similar, it feels different. And again, I'm super lucky to have Tom as my editor, because he knows what I write with Matt, and he knows what I write with Jack Ryan Jr. And in my first book, in Target Acquire, there were my first Clancy book, there were portions where he said, no, Jack Ryan Jr. would never talk this way to Clark. That's Matt Drake coming through. And so that kind of bothered me a little bit at first, because I'm like, I got that wrong. But now I just look at it as that he is kind of my guardrails or my safety net. And so I just write the way I think the story needs to go. And I know that he's going to pull me back if I've let one slip into the other.
Are you able to share with us the name of the SR-71 pilot?
Yeah, his name is Bob, and I'm looking around as if I have his name here. I can't remember. I don't know why I'm doing that. I can't remember his second name, his last name, but his call sign is Lorenzo. And he actually, when I announced Weapons Grade, I said he has a fantastic. I'm trying to work it so that potentially one of the event he does with me, because his stories are just incredible. And so I said, hey, when I announce this, can you send me a picture or something? And so he sent me his picture in front of the SR-71 holding his helmet, and then one of his patches from the uniform. So his call sign's Lorenzo. He flew both U-2s and the SR-71 wow. and was a graduate of the test pilot school. And he's an amazing guy. So hopefully we can do an event together.
For both of you, Brian and Don, what military movies do you feel have been the most accurate portrayals of military life or history?
Brian, you want to take that one first?
I mean, I think that there's some recent efforts, like 13 Hours is a really good one that shows sort of, the intersection of post-military service, contractor life, intelligence, sort of everything, what that whole universe is like. Black Hawk Down, if you want to look at sort of maybe the ultimate gold standard for real authenticity in military films. So those would be the 2 that I would say sort of cover the gamut of, special operations all the way through, intelligence service.
Besides Top Gun Maverick, my next choice would have to be the We Were Soldiers One, or not We Were Soldiers Once. That one's good too, but Band of Brothers. Like, I love that miniseries. It's so well done. It's such a great depiction of what it's like to go to combat, to train to go to combat, and that series was just incredible.
And finally, for the both of you, as AI continues to evolve, how do you see it impacting military usage and operations?
I'll talk first, then not specifically AI. I'll go back to the machine learning stuff. There's a lot of really interesting things that are being done to do what they call manned and unmanned pairing. And so the newest version of the Apache helicopter, the Guardian, the Echo model, you can actually fly or give commands and stuff to a unmanned aerial system from the front seat. And so that's kind of like a lower level, the pilot pointing and clicking. I've seen some other interesting things that says, hey, what if we, instead of trying to have a pilot control the unmanned, their wingman, what if we used machine learning to make that wingman the very best wingman it could be? And so its job is to protect the manned aircraft. And I've seen some really interesting things done that. There's some really interesting articles right now on, I'm getting the term wrong, but it's basically like a swarm, an intelligent swarm, but of bombs. And so that you release this entire weapons payload that are all linked together, do it. And so there's some interesting, and I guess by interesting, you could also change that word out for terrifying, but there are some very interesting things happening. What do you think, Brian?
Yeah, I agree with you. This hat I'm wearing is from the USS Indiana. Just went underway. It's a Virginia class submarine, went underway a couple of weeks ago. For research, the Navy was very accommodating to let us go underway so we could see, hey, how have things changed, in 40 years since Red October. And, it's like you're saying, Don, when the pilot, it's no longer a helmsman and a planesman, it's a pilot and a co-pilot. And when the Virginia class, when they want to change depth or change course, they can enter the new course and the new depth on a touch screen. And now the computer that has basically accumulated all the knowledge of, hey, there's hydrodynamic effects when you put on a rudder. The submarine's going to bank and it's going to slow down, and now it's going to want to sink out because you just took away speed. So what's the optimal amount that you adjust the bow planes and the stir planes? This is something that used to take, a helmsman and a planesman. They would take them years and many watch cycles operating together before they would get in sync and get this perfectly. Now the Virginia has all this knowledge. It's figured it out. And so that the machine is turning the ship. It's keeping it on depth and it's doing it perfectly. And I think, that's sort of like you were saying, that's sort of at the very basic level AI. When you start getting into, these more complex, pushing these C2 nodes out, where you're pushing command and control out sort of forward in the battle space. And you have this, AI making decisions or assessing data in a black box. I think there's more uncertainty for the military now than there's ever been. And I think that uncertainty is causing a lot of consternation, a lot of concern and anxiety, because we don't really know. We know there's an AI arms race, so to speak, between us and China and Russia. We just don't know how it's going to play out, and we don't know if it's a winner take all scenario. So, anxiety, exciting, but a lot of anxiety at the same time.
So we could also translate this to publishing, because you've already used the word fan fiction. If that's what you're writing, AI might actually be able to do that as well as Don or Brian and Jeff. Although I did have a comforting conversation with Dave Berry a couple of weeks ago when he pointed out that AI is never going to really develop a sense of humor. So, but seriously, I mean, it's a big question about in publishing for a lot of reasons, but the fan fiction thing is. And then my husband decided that we needed a smart bed. This bed every morning sends you data about how you slept, and it adjusts to you as you sleep on it. It's so creepy. You get up, there's a light underneath it that goes on. And I thought, oh my God, if it's coming to this, that your furniture now is doing this to you. So when you're here, I'll have to show it to you. It is really sort of, just totally.
Yeah, the question is that you're when you get up and you like, I don't think I slept very well. Does it tell you, do you agree with it or not agree with it?
I got a 73% rating the other night, but it didn't notice that the puppy had come, one of the dogs had come to sleep. But, the other thing I find really unnerving, because, it goes up and does all this other stuff. If you hit the button and it's going to go like completely flat, the first thing it says to you before it agrees to do that, is there any children or dogs? As the bed comes down, So anyway, I finding this whole new world to be pretty scary, but AI in your bed, think about that. So played even more exciting. Anyway, guys, it's always a pleasure. So Brian Andrews, I'm sorry Jeff Wilson isn't with us, but we'll be having more conversations. Don, always a pleasure. I'm so glad I get to see Don like every 6 weeks. Anyway, Don will be here on June 13th with an author that he is very gung-ho about, who does not write military fiction. But I'm looking forward to that. And then Matt, political thrillers are doing interesting things. And so Matthew Quirk is going to come and see us. I think it's June 20th or 22nd. But for those of you who watched The Night Agent on Netflix, he has a new book out that I think might even be more exciting if it were turned into television. And at least they kind of followed the book as opposed to what we've been talking about. So all kinds of good things happening. Anyway, thanks for watching, everybody. Thank you guys for joining us. And good night.
Thanks.
Oh, and don't forget, you can actually order Don's book, even though we're sold out, because since I mentioned he's coming back, there it is, Flashpoint. We will have more Flashpoint. Didn't you have a copy of the other one, Ian?
Oh yeah, Forgotten War. Yes.
Forgotten War. Yeah. Right. So that is the last Matt Drake book, and we still have copies of those too. So I'll send out an email to everybody about what to do with that. And Dempsey, right? Yay. All right.
Yay.
Bye.
Thanks. See ya.
Great job, dude.
Thanks for having us. And thanks, Brian. I appreciate it, man.